I remember the look on my son's face the day they told me to leave. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, and said it like it was a verdict. "Don't come back," he said, as if my grief made me invisible. My wife's photo still warm in my hands, and their words sliced through me. I should have been at her bedside. Instead, I was being escorted out. Neighbors watched. My keys bumped coldly in my palm. They looked at me like I was already dead. Or worse, a nuisance. My heart was packed in a cardboard box, alongside the last of our china. I walked out pretending my legs weren't shaking. They closed the door behind me and, celebrated like a storm had passed, sat on the front steps and counted breaths until the noise stopped. That night, I slept on an old bench in my truck, clutching a vice of rage. At dawn, I watched them through the kitchen window, laughing, careless. The funeral was yesterday. They had already moved like my life was an item to discard. I swallowed bile and promised myself one thing. I would not leave as they expected. Grief taught me patience. Betrayal taught me how to wait. They thought my sorrow would shrink me. They were wrong. They thought isolation would make me disappear. They were wrong. I learned how to hide a storm behind a calm face. I learned how to count allies in silence and plans in the dark. They had taken my home, my dignity, and my peace, but not my mind tonight. When they sleep with smug smiles, I will begin. I won't just come back. I will come back with their world laid bare. They told me never to return. And that is the one command I intend to obey, by breaking it. I remember the chill before dawn, and the way the sky would blush pink over the fields. That was my clock for 40 years. I was up before the sun, hands raw from winter, and knuckles stained with soil. The land wasn't just work, it was our family's heartbeat. When my wife and I married, we left a small, easier life in town because she loved the wide horizon. I gave her that horizon and never once regretted it. Fatherhood arrived like a sunrise I had to meet every day. Diapers, scraped knees, PTA meetings I attended between milking and mending fences. I learned to divide my time like currency. A few extra minutes for homework, an hour more in the fields, a promise that I would always be there. There were seasons when the harvest paid for school books, and seasons when it barely paid for bread. Still, I tightened my belt and smiled at breakfast. I traded nights out and small, selfish pleasures for extra shifts, overtime, and the satisfaction of seeing my children eat without worry. When my son wanted a bicycle, I stayed up sewing a leather saddle by hand rather than buying one. He rode it like a king, unaware of the stitches. My daughter wanted piano lessons. I cashed in a planned repair to make sure she practiced Fur Elise with a proud, determined grin. We had a ritual of Sunday tea, black, strong, poured into chipped cups. When my wife would hum and laundry would hang like flags in the breeze. Those little routines were our fortress. The creak of the kitchen chair, the squeak of the old gate, the smell of stew on cold nights. When the bills piled high and the doctor's visits began, I sold things I loved quietly, a watch, a tractor part, without telling anyone to keep worry away. I never wanted my children to know how heavy the nights were, so I learned to hide fear behind whistled hymns and forced humor. There were sleepless stretches at the hospital where I slept in a plastic chair and woke with a crick in my neck and my wife's hand still cool beneath mine. I learned which face in a doctor's office meant hope and which meant careful words. I learned to carry silence like a package, unopened. Friends offered help. I accepted some and turned down others because pride and responsibility were tangled in my chest. I taught my children how to fix a fence, how to balance books, how to greet a neighbor with a hand and not a list of complaints. My daughter learned to bake because I taught her how to knead. My son learned to hammer because I once taught him to build a shelf that still stands. We celebrated small victories: a fat tomato in August, a baby's first step, the first paycheck that actually surprised us with a little extra. At night I would sit on the porch with my wife and count stars like inventory, and we'd whisper plans about grandchildren and painting the old fence a bright white. Loneliness crept in slowly after. Treatments took more than they gave. It wasn't sudden. It was a quiet subtraction of presence and laughter. Still, I made sure the house smelled like something homey. Bread in the oven, a candle on Sundays, photo frames wiped and placed where light would kiss them. I gave up vacations, expensive tools, even the idea of retirement, because the farm needed tending and the family needed me more than a distant promised leisure. When the winter nights were long, I warmed myself with the memory of my wife's laugh and the sound of my children learning to be kind. All of those small, ordinary sacrifices stitched together into a life I thought was unbreakable, built not with wealth, but with constancy and care. I loved them with the kind of stubbornness that didn't wait for thanks. I loved them by showing up, by paying, by forgiving small slights. If you asked me then what I had, I would have said everything. A daughter who sang in the kitchen, a son who fixed the tractor, a wife whose hand fit mine. That life, messy, expensive, humble, was the thing I worked to protect. I never dreamed my devotion would be used as an excuse to push me out. The betrayal didn't arrive as a thunderclap. It crept in like a slow leak I didn't notice until the floorboards sagged. At first, it was small things: a missing toolbox, a locked cabinet I'd never locked, a check I didn't recognize. "Dad, we need to talk about money," my daughter said one evening while clearing plates, as if she were discussing milk prices. Her voice was flat. My stomach dropped. "What money?" I asked, and the question felt foolish even as I said it. "We can't keep covering the medical bills," my son said from the doorway, eyes darting away like he expected me to be an opponent. Ford showed them bank statements and receipts, things I'd kept since before the mortgage, and they skimmed them like they were recipes. "Maybe it's time you moved in with Aunt Marie," my daughter suggested, with the soft cruelty of someone offering a favor that's really a sentence. I remember the exact cold of the kitchen tile under my feet when she said it, as if the house itself had turned on me. "Move in?" I laughed, and they looked at me like a man who'd just told a bad joke. "This is my home," I said. "It's not practical, Dad," my son answered. "We're not trying to hurt you. It's just—" He stopped, as if the sentence would injure him. They left the sentence hanging. I filled it myself with the memory of my wife's photos on the mantel. Then came the paper. My son slid an envelope across the table like a social worker administering a form. "This is the deed transfer," he said. "Just sign here, for your care." His voice was disturbingly calm, practiced. "For her care," I echoed, and the words tasted like metal. "Why are you doing this now?" I asked, breath shallow. "We're taking responsibility," my daughter said, eyes glossy but steady. "We can manage it better." "Manage it?" I repeated, feeling something inside me hollow like an emptied silo. "You're selling our past." "You're being dramatic," my son snapped, sharper than I expected. "Look, we're balancing the books." I asked for time. "Give me a day to think," I said, and they exchanged looks that said they'd already thought and decided without me. That night, I slept on the couch, the paper under my pillow like a noose I hadn't seen until I tucked it in. The funeral was a thin scar on my throat. While I mourned, they were meeting with men in suits who spoke of assets and liquidation. I overheard my daughter laugh on the phone. "We'll cover it. He won't even notice." The laugh landed like a slap. At the wake, hands that once clapped me on the back now passed me quietly and steered conversation away from the house. "Don't make this about yourself, Dad," my son told me later in the hallway, his voice low and fierce. "We're doing what's best. What's best?" I asked, voice breaking. "Is selling the barn what's best? Is auctioning her quilt what's best?" They answered with a list of obligations and deadlines and practicality, words dressed as reasons, but smelling of greed. One afternoon, I walked into the barn and found a buyer's receipt pinned to the post, the ink dry and final. A truck idled at the gate the next morning, while a man I barely knew loaded boxes into it as if they were nothing more than compost. I stood there, hands on the fence, while he took the hammer my son learned with and the rocking chair my wife rocked in. "You shouldn't hang on to things when they hold you back," my daughter told me later, as if things could betray back. Shock was the first color I felt, a peculiar gray that muffled sound and sense. I replayed their words like static. Sadness came next, heavy and dull, a lead blanket I couldn't shake. I found myself wandering rooms, searching for the echo of my wife. Disbelief sat beside me at the table, a stubborn guest that refused to leave. Did they really change the locks, the accounts, the names? Anger arrived last, hot and bright as spilled oil, and it didn't announce itself. It crept up my spine and settled behind my eyes. "You sold the tractor?" I demanded quietly one morning, because shouting felt useless in a house that had already raised its voice at me. My son shrugged, as if shrugging could erase history. "We needed the money. We're making choices." "Who decided your choices were mine to accept?" I asked, but they had rehearsed the answer. "We did, Dad, for the family." Humiliation stung worse than the losses. Neighbors began to look at me differently, as if my grief made me a charity case. Someone called me old man at the market like it was an observation, not an insult, and my grandson repeated it like an innocent. Every small indignity stitched together until I felt stripped, not only of things, but of dignity, of the quiet respect I had earned. I watched them divide heirlooms like a deck of cards, each cut a precise calculation, each laugh a tiny betrayal. Their betrayal was not a single blow. It was a sequence of choices, each one rationalized, each one sharpening the blade. By the time rage warmed my hands, the wound had been open a long time, and I had time to learn the faces of those who would walk over it. I sat in my empty kitchen and counted the ways they'd rewritten our life without consulting the author. When disbelief finally cracked into anger, something in me decided that this wound would not be allowed to fester untouched. And that decision hummed like a live wire under the skin. I remember the exact creak of the floorboard when I walked into the barn that morning. It sounded like a clock that had finally given up. Sunlight streamed through the gaps in the slats, cutting the dust into ribbons that hung in the air like unanswered prayers. I ran my hand along the workbench where my wife's mason jar of nails always sat. The jar was gone. A motley of emptiness greeted me. Hooks without tools, a stool with a missing leg, the scent of oil replaced by a clean, commercial smell. My heart thudded against my ribs in a way that felt almost foreign, as if it were trying to tell me something I had been too tired to hear before. I thought of the first hammer my father handed me, and how proud my son once was of the shelf we built together. The grain of the wood, a map of our family. There was a receipt tacked to a post, the ink fresh and indifferent. Sold to? And a number I didn't recognize. For a moment I stood very still and let the world rearrange itself around that little paper, like a storm moving a town overnight. Shock was the first coat I wore. It made everything slightly out of focus, as if someone had smeared my glasses. I went home and sat at the kitchen table where my wife used to set 2 mugs and hum. I could hear the silence, like a foreign language. My hands trembled so badly I could barely lift the mug. The tea sloshed over and left a dark ring on the wood like a bruise. Grief came next. Not the soft, small grief of a single memory, but a tidal grief that seemed to pull at every joint in my body. I thought about her hand in mine the night before the ambulance, the way she whispered my name, trusting me to hold the world together. How could those same hands be folded away into cardboard boxes and auction catalogs while they counted profit like apples? Disbelief kept knocking at the door of my mind. They had her bed sold, her quilts packed, her favorite chair lifted out the back, as if it were a piece of junk. Anger arrived hot and sudden, like someone throwing a pail of cold water on a buried ember. It flared into a bright, manageable flame. I found myself listing every small injustice in my head. Each sale, each signature, each polite lie that had piled up into this mountain. They said they were doing what was best. The words replayed in my ears, each repetition stripping another layer of patience away. I remembered the times I'd stayed up all night by a hospital bed, counting breaths instead of sheep, trading future comforts for present care. My internal voice began to change from question to command. Why did they think they could decide for me? Who gave them that right? Anger sharpened into clarity. It was no longer a blind ache. It was a lens, focusing on names, dates, and deeds. I thought about how I had always measured love in actions, and how they had measured me in convenience. There was a part of me that wanted to shout and break something, to make noise loud enough to wake everyone from their comfortable indifference. But another part, colder and wiser, whispered that noise would only feed their story that I was a broken old man. So I let the anger simmer into a plan-shaped resolve. I would not be hasty. I would be intentional. I walked through the rooms one last time and collected small tokens. A chipped spoon, a photograph with a bent corner, the key to the cellar. Each item fit into the pocket of my coat like ammunition. Not for violence, but for proof and memory. I sat on the back steps until the stars came out and let the silence speak to me. There the vow slowly crystallized in my chest. No more being moved around like furniture. No more being used as an excuse for someone else's convenience. I would not want revenge for the sake of hurting them. I wanted justice, restoration, and a life returned to something resembling what it was. My hands stopped trembling. My breath steadied. The grief was still there, but it now shared space with something else. Determination. I whispered to my wife's photograph as if speaking to a co-conspirator. Watch me. I'll make them see what they did. And then, with the cold certainty of a man who has been broken and learned the geometry of mending, I said aloud into the dark, "Enough is enough. I will not be pushed aside. I will come back, and I will take what is mine." I started the plan the way I always start anything important. Quietly, with my ears open. First, I stopped telling anyone where I was going. Secrecy became the new habit of my days. I learned to listen for patterns. Who called whom, when trucks came, which invoices matched which bank stamps. My first ally was an old clerk from the county office who owed me for a favor years ago. He taught me where paper hides. A young paralegal answered my ad for help. She had fire in her eyes and no patience for scams. She became my second pair of hands. I taught myself to use a computer in the late hours, the glow on my face as steady as a lantern, learning search terms and file names. I spent evenings at the diner, asking casual questions to the right people and pretending I was only passing time. At the hardware store, I traded small favors for overheard fragments. a delivery manifest here, a contractor's name there. I opened a sealed notebook and began cataloging everything. Dates, receipts, odd phone numbers, names that repeated like a chorus. Every entry was a promise to myself. If it mattered, it went into the book. If it could be proved, it stayed. I arranged small, deliberate meetings with neighbors who had seen trucks at strange hours. Fear became courage when shared. There was a retired accountant who liked puzzles. He took one look at the ledgers and muttered, "Someone's been clever." We fitted the cleverness like a glove, following the money through shell names and roundabout payments that smelled of disguise. I wrote to banks using reasoned language. I didn't accuse, I inquired. And those who deal in facts must answer? Facts. A reporter I'd once waved at in the grocery store agreed to listen after I fed her a breadcrumb of truth she couldn't ignore. I practiced, my face in the mirror so I could sit in a deposition and look like a man who remembers, not a man who rages. I planted small seeds of doubt with a banker who liked neat paperwork and hated sloppy signatures. He started asking questions. Every legal motion we prepared was surgical. Temporary freezes, requests for audits, subpoenas that would later snap shut. I never rushed. Impatience would have been my undoing, so I let the plan simmer like a stew that needed time to pull flavor. There were nights I drove out of town just to clear my head, coming back with a new line of thought and a crisper aim. I used a borrowed phone for calls I didn't want traced to my name, and an anonymous email to pass documents I could prove were real. Sometimes I played small lies, a whispered rumor here, a planted receipt there, to watch how they scurried and showed their hands. I set traps not with malice, but with logic. A flagged transfer here, a paper trail exposed there, each move revealing their next move. A contractor who had been paid in cash grew nervous and agreed to sign a sworn statement about crates taken at night. The paralegal found a loose will clause that didn't match the signatures on the bank's file. That single mismatch was a key. I used patience as currency. While they celebrated little freedoms, I quietly moved to close the doors they thought were open. There were resources I wouldn't name. Favors, documents, a ledger tucked in a glove box. That would speak louder than my voice. And always, I kept back a final piece, folded and hidden, because showing everything would be like revealing all your cards before the last hand. What they saw me do was smile at supper, fix a fence, and nod at grandchildren. What they didn't see was the clockwork I had wound. I don't tell you all of it now because some things must remain in shadow until the right hour. Suspense is a tool as sharp as any ledger. Soon the small things we planted will grow into proof, and the quiet work of months will become a tide they cannot stand against. I set the first trap the way a farmer sets a snare, quietly, where footsteps were sure to fall. A certified letter landed in the bank one gray morning. A formal request to freeze accounts pending audit. My son laughed when I told him I'd questioned a few transfers. He thought I was rattling ghosts. Then the phone calls began. Polite, procedural, from people who ask for paperwork, not pity. The old clerk I'd befriended produced a ledger entry that did not belong to their name. A shell company had a trace. When the auditor arrived, he asked for invoices. My paralegal handed him copies we'd pulled clean and organized. My daughter's face, once so quick to smear a smile, stiffened when she saw our file, laid bare across the desk. The first twist came from where I least expected it. The contractor who'd hauled crates at night flipped when offered immunity for truth. He brought photographs of a midnight pickup and a signed receipt with a fake name. I watched him squirm on my side and felt no victory, only proof. We served subpoenas quietly. They thought paperwork would scare me off. Instead, The subpoenas pointed like accusation fingers. A reporter ran the first piece with my initials only. The town murmured, then snorted, then demanded names. Public pressure is a slow, sharp thing. People who'd once avoided my glance now whispered in the grocery aisle. They tried to bribe a mechanic to forge service records. The mechanic turned the tapes over to me instead, ashamed and shaking. The second twist was personal. My grandson, innocent and curious, had recorded his parents arguing, the exact phrases that would later sting them in court. I played that recording for the right ears. The lawyer whose specialty was family fraud. He smiled like a man who enjoys putting wrongs in order. We filed for injunctions to keep sold goods from changing hands. A buyer who'd paid cash found his purchase tied to litigation and wanted nothing to do with it. The town bank froze transfers while investigators traced payments through at least 3 different shell accounts. In a deposition, my son's practiced calm cracked. He hesitated, then blamed his partner, then himself. Small fissures that became canyons under cross-examination. The third twist: my daughter had signed paperwork with her name misspelled on an important document. The lawyer called it a forger's footprint. When the paper trail led to the partner of my son's business, prosecutors took notice. Suddenly, the quiet, civil case had teeth. The reporter published the names, the dates, the receipts. Friends stopped answering phones. Contractors washed their hands. They tried to mount a counterattack, a smear campaign painting me as a bitter old man. But my journal, sworn and dated, neutralized the noise. Character witnesses came forward. Neighbors who'd seen trucks at odd hours. The hospice nurse who'd noticed missing items. The contractor with photos. At a hearing, the judge read through the evidence and asked one simple question. Who stood to benefit? The silence in the room said it all. Assets were temporarily reclaimed and placed in a court-managed estate account. Sales were reversed where possible, and proceeds redirected to settle debts. Their business partner faced an investigation into fraudulent billing. His reputation crumbled, and he lost the clients that once trusted him. My son's lender pulled a line of credit when auditors flagged irregularities. Contractors withdrew contracts. The SUV they'd just bought was repossessed under lien. Humiliation does not equal justice, but it does remove the safety net of impunity. They found their actions had consequences beyond cash. They came to me one evening, hollow-eyed and embarrassed, asking for mercy in words that tasted like rehearsed regret. I answered, in the same calm I'd kept for months. I wanted restitution, not revenge for revenge's sake. Proof that what they had done could not be done again. The final surprise was quieter than all the rest. Some of the neighbors I thought had turned away brought casseroles and quietly apologized, then helped me fix the fence. Court papers returned ownership where law demanded. Some of the proceeds we used to establish a trust for the grandchildren and to pay my late wife's outstanding bills. The last twist was the smallest. My grandson came to me and, with childish solemnity, handed back the chipped spoon I'd once given him, the one I'd thought lost. When the courtroom doors closed on the last hearing, their shoulders were smaller and their smiles forced. The town's respect had shifted. I didn't dance on their ruin. I sat on my porch and listened to the cows lowing and the wash of evening over the fields. Revenge had unfolded like a harvest. Careful planting, patient tending, and then a reaping that felt necessary and inevitable. What they called punishment was, to me, the restoration of truth, the ledger balanced, the names corrected, the dignity returned in parts. I'd wanted exposure, and exposure came. I'd wanted to reclaim life, and I did, not untouched, but intact enough to move forward. In the end, they were punished where it mattered most. Reputation, security, and the ease of their consciences, all of which had been built on my labor. I watched them leave the courtroom with faces I no longer recognized and felt a strange, careful peace settle over me like a well-earned cloak. When the dust finally settled, silence filled the house that once echoed with arguments and betrayal. I remember walking through those old rooms. Every floorboard creaked the same way, but the air felt cleaner, lighter, freer. For the first time in years, I could breathe without anger sitting heavy on my chest. The documents were signed, the property restored, and the accounts cleared. Yet it didn't feel like victory. It felt like survival. I sat on the porch one morning, coffee steaming in the pale light, and realized revenge hadn't made me rich. It had made me empty, but honest. There was peace in that emptiness, a kind of silence that doesn't demand forgiveness, but no longer needs hate. Neighbors who once whispered about me now nodded respectfully as they passed, their eyes soft with quiet understanding. Some even came to share how my fight had inspired them to stand against their own injustices. I never bragged about what I'd done. Revenge doesn't need an audience. It only needs purpose. Still, when I looked across the fields, I thought of my wife and wondered if she'd approve of the man I'd become. I whispered her name into the wind that brushed over the tall grass and hoped she'd know it was all for her, for the life we built, and they tried to steal. The grandchildren came back slowly, shy at first. Confused by the tension, they didn't understand. I didn't tell them about courtrooms or confessions. I told them about hard work, honesty, and keeping promises. In their laughter, I found the kind of peace that revenge alone could never bring. I used part of the recovered money to rebuild the farmhouse and set up a scholarship fund in her name. Small acts of creation after so much destruction. There were nights when loneliness still crept in, whispering that revenge doesn't heal. It only balances the scales. But each morning, the sun rose over my land again. Mine, not because I fought for property, but because I fought for dignity. One day, my daughter came to see me. Eyes swollen, hands trembling. She didn't ask for money or forgiveness. She asked for a chance to start again. I didn't speak right away. I simply looked at her. And for the first time, I saw not my betrayer, but a broken person who'd learned the cost of greed. I gave her a simple answer. If you're willing to rebuild what you destroyed, start by telling the truth. Tears fell, and for a long while, neither of us spoke. Maybe that was enough. Revenge had given me justice, but truth gave me peace. And peace was the one thing money could never buy back. As I watched the sunset from my porch now, I realized the greatest victory wasn't taking everything they owned. It was taking back myself. And if there's one lesson I've learned, it's this: never mistake kindness for weakness, but never let vengeance steal your soul. Justice is best served not with rage, but with calm. When you can finally look at those who wronged you and feel nothing but freedom.